Welcome to Diffused Congruence. My name is Zaki Hasan. I'm here with Parvez Ahmed, and this is the American Muslim Experience.
Hey, Zaki. Welcome welcome listeners, and good to be back with you.
It's been a while.
Yeah, we're actually here in the studio. This has been a while because we've been on the road, as it were.
Yeah, like 3 live shows in a row?
Yeah, 3 live shows in a row. 2 in Michigan, and then the one right here in the Bay, but at Tel Aviv. So it's good to be back in the studio. Our man Dre behind the scenes there. So
here at Hub 925 in Pleasanton, California. Always grateful to have the space available. Always grateful to Dre being in the room.
That's right. And so for us, Eid came a little early. So Eid Mubarak, or Eid Kareem, Eid Saeed, Happy Eid, whatever your greeting of choice is.
Word.
And I say Eid came early for us because I'm super excited about today's guest.
Yes.
Because this is a conversation I've been wanting to have, and I think we couldn't have found a better guest to have that conversation.
We didn't need to make 3 wishes. This was our first wish.
You're tipping the hat a little, but
yes.
There you go.
Have you seen Aladdin yet?
I have not seen Aladdin yet.
You've seen the cartoon.
Yes, I have, of course.
Whether Muslim or not Muslim, it's one of those things. I don't know. I was in 8th grade when Aladdin came out, and I feel like every Muslim kid who grew up in that time frame had to answer the Aladdin question, like, oh, do you guys have magic lamps? And
right.
If I was called Aladdin, that would have been the better end. Like, hey, Aladdin. I'd be like, that's okay.
There was worse things to be called.
There's worse things to be called
at that time. Yeah.
Because, here's the thing. I think this goes to something, which is that when I was growing up, I got 2 questions. Number 1, do you have magic lamps, magic carpets? And also, do you have eyeball soup and chilled monkey brains?
Oh, yeah, there you go.
So, which goes to the general cultural confusion that pervades the West, where all brown people do all. Well, first of all, no brown people eat eyeball soup. Let me clarify that. Indiana Jones was wrong.
Right.
But, that was a thing growing up. And so now we have the live action adaptation of Disney's Aladdin. And this is the important clarification. This is Disney's adaptation of Disney's Aladdin.
Right.
It's not a historical document.
There you go.
That's meant to represent. And Agrabah is not a real place.
That's right.
It's also worth pointing out.
Right. No more than is the live action version of Cinderella or Beauty and the Beast historical pieces.
That's exactly right.
It's
not true to the historical beast. Yeah,
exactly.
But I mean, this is important because this movie came out, the new one, and it made a lot of dollars, Aladdin dollars, $100 million plus over the opening weekend. Big hit.
So they're happy. They're happy with the numbers.
Yeah, and so the conversation surrounding the film have been very interesting because specifically within the Arab community, the Muslim community, brown people communities, it's been I've heard all sides.
Yeah.
And I'm neutral. I'm Switzerland when it comes to this whole conversation. But you have not seen it yet.
I have not seen it yet, and but I intend to. I'm one of those crazy Muslims who goes on a little bit of a what's the word? Take a little bit of a
movie hiatus.
A movie hiatus, thank you. That's right. But I do plan on visiting it. My kids. So my 16-year-old daughter saw it and she loved it. But that may be just probably at her age. She just probably finds the actor playing Aladdin dreamy. So that's probably what it is.
Sure.
Anything else?
Mina Masood.
Okay, that's his name?
Yes.
Right. I find Will Smith dreamy, so...
Yeah, that's true.
But anyway, I don't want to bury the lead here, and we do want to bring in our guest, who I'm super excited about. And one thing I want to kind of throw out there in the ether, and then maybe revisit this conversation with our guest, which is what I find interesting about a lot of the conversations that happened around Aladdin, whether it was the live-action remake or the original cartoon film, is certainly about portrayals and stereotypes of Middle Eastern, of people of Middle Eastern descent, of Muslims, and so on. But what's interesting is the Jungle Book, right? Which is also they've done the cartoon and then the live action remake. Now, Rudyard Kipling was a English colonizer in India, and the book, the Jungle Book, is a metaphor of the white man's burden, white civilization coming in and doing all, so about, I think, those stereotypes. But yet you don't find that conversation happening around the Jungle Book, which is a very problematic text to begin with. Although I guess Disney can say, well, this is just a cartoon adaptation, and hence the live action version is a remake of the cartoon.
I mean, I would argue that, and certainly the live action one, it moves pretty far afield from Kipling.
Yeah.
and certainly I don't get the white man's burden
right
subtext.
That's right.
That's been drained out of it.
Right.
So I mean, in a sense, that's adaptation done right, arguably, at least if we're talking about historical context.
Yeah. I think Netflix did a version called Mowgli, which I think is a little bit more problematic.
Yeah, Andy Serkis
directed it. Straight to
Netflix.
Yeah, there you go.
So our guest for this episode, who I'm very excited to have joining us, wrote an article exactly about Aladdin and the nuanced conversation that can and should be had surrounding the film, both acknowledging the pluses and the minuses. She is Evelyn Alsultany. She is a leading expert on the history of representations of Arabs and Muslims in the U.S. media and on forms of anti-Arab and anti-Muslim racism. She's associate professor in the Department of American Studies and Ethnicity at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, and her research contends with the fraught cultural politics of Arab and Muslim identities in the contemporary U.S. through an interdisciplinary approach that draws from media and cultural studies, race and ethnic studies, gender studies, and Arab and Muslim American studies. Dr. Alsultany, thank you so much for coming on with us.
Thank you both for having me. Assalamu alaikum and happy
Eid. Yeah, thank you. Happy Eid to you as well, and thank you for putting up with our banter. We kind of had a little bit of a longer stretch of banter. Typically, we kind of launch right into our guests, but I think the show and the conversation that we hope to have kind of.
I missed you, man.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been good. And I should also mention, I think in the bio, whether or not it was highlighted, but. I'd love to kind of, if you've heard the show, you kind of know we like to kind of start off with the origin story. So maybe, before we launch into a full-fledged conversation around representation and stereotypes and Hollywood and, media portrayal of Arabs and Muslims, if you could tell us a little bit about your background. I know I've listened to your TED Talk, so I know you have a very interesting background that I'd love to kind of talk about first.
Yeah, so I was born and raised in New York City, and my father was from Iraq. And he was a Muslim Shia from Iraq. He came to the United States in the 1960s.
Okay.
And my mom was from Cuba and Cuban Catholic. And she came right after the Cuban Revolution in the early 1960s. She passed away when I was little. And my father remarried my stepmother, who's from Colombia, Catholic. And she raised me since I was 6. And so I grew up in a very... multi-religious household, but it was very much a Muslim household. So my stepmom learned all the prayers in Arabic. She was down with the whole deal. And but my father was very religiously flexible, obviously, since he married 2 Catholic women.
2 Catholic of Latin background too. So
that too. A type, maybe.
Yeah. Right. Right.
So when I was growing up, though he was very active in fundraising for the Al-Houy Mosque in Queens, we would regularly go to church, and while my stepmom was doing the sign of the cross, we'd be Bismillah Rahman Rahim, sitting in the pews and doing it that way.
Right. So I imagine just growing up that way in a very, like you said, multicultural, multi-religious even household, but at the same time sort of dealing with, I guess, stereotypes at a very early age, just given that kind of, background, because your father was of Iraqi descent and your whether it was your Cuban mother or, your stepmom being Colombian, right? They're not exactly, free from stereotypes either. So, yeah, how was that growing up? But of course, in the context of Queens, which I imagine is pretty, multicultural, as in terms of a context.
You froze for me for a moment. Can you hear me?
Yeah. We can. Yeah.
Okay. So one of the stories that I share on that TED Talk is that when I was growing up, my parents would lie about where they were from. And that was a very formative experience for me. My father really wanted to fit in. He was sick and tired of questions about terrorism. My stepmother was asked about cocaine all the time. And so as a young girl, I have 2 distinct memories around identity. One was that my father, his name was Kamal, and he went by Ken for about a decade, and then he went back to Kamal. But I remember as a 6-year-old, the first time I heard him introduce himself to someone as Ken, I burst out laughing, thinking, who's Ken? Ken is Barbie's boyfriend. This is my dad. What is he doing? And the other memory I have, which was something that happened all the time, so it wasn't just one memory, but it was just part of our story, was we'd be out and people would come up and say, where are you from? Who are you? Where are you from? Such a, this common question. And my father would say he was from Turkey. I suppose he thought Turkey had a better reputation in the United States than Iraq. And my stepmom would say she was from Spain. And as a child, I just wondered, why would they lie about where they're from?
Right.
And I later realized that when they did say where they were from, they would get all sorts of very invasive and assumptive questions about how they make their money. And they just didn't want to deal with that every single day of their lives. But that definitely informed for me later on, what I've come to study and devote my life to.
You know what I find interesting? I mean, just your father's experiences in particular, because I mean, he came here at a time where, even even if we flash forward into the 80s, the boogeyman was Iran, and Iraq was sort of our ally, and Saddam Hussein was our ally, and he was fighting the good fight against Ayatollah Khomeini. So in spite of that foreign policy context of sort of the ally, yet he still sort of was dealing and contending with that, with just the stereotypes around being Arab and of Middle Eastern background, correct?
Yeah, I feel like after 9/11, we've been able to have a very explicit conversation about the experiences of both Arabs and Muslims and racialization in the United States. But many talk about it as if it's new. And growing up, my father was dealing with it constantly, as many others were at the time. So he was very, on the one hand, he was very serious about being Muslim and, contributing to mosque building. And on the other hand, he definitely learned along the way that religion is something you do privately. Religion is something you do at home. You don't do it in public. And he wanted to avoid all of the questions and the assumptions. So that was evident by him going by Ken. That was evident by, we can sit in a church and do our prayers.
That's right.
So I see him as very much impacted by all of the pressures of American life and really trying to figure out how to raise his kids and how to be himself in this country.
I want to just make a quick, housekeeping note to our listeners. Dr. Alsultany joins us from her home in Southern California, and we are here, of course, in the Bay at the studio. So this is a little bit of a new thing for us of being able to record remotely here in the studio. But anyway, I guess I'd love for you to then kind of get into your academic career and your studies and then kind of bring that into the conversation that we really want to have about representation in the media and so on.
So when I was growing up, I grew up in Manhattan and near Lincoln Center. And my brother and we were obsessed with popular culture, music, movies, and the big events when we were growing up was when Tower Records and Tower Video opened in our neighborhood. I remember when MTV started. These were huge, events in our childhood. Or Live Aid was also a big childhood event. And I was a first-generation college student, and it was very, very important to my father that I be educated, that I get an elite education. He really wanted me to be either a business person or a lawyer. He saw those as very prestigious careers. He wanted me to make a lot of money. He wanted me to be financially independent. So he pressed education. And my brother's older. He went to college and he dropped out of college. And it was the biggest disappointment in the family. And I remember when I went to college, I felt really alienated and confused. It seemed on the surface, later on I found little pockets, but on the surface it was very Eurocentric and alienating. And I just didn't have the academic preparation to really understand the options in front of me. And I remember thinking about dropping out. I wanted to follow my brother's footsteps. And I thought, but I can't do that. My parents are going to be so disappointed in me, and I'll do anything to not have them be disappointed in me. And my turning point was taking a women's studies class. at the University of Michigan. I was an undergraduate there. And it was the first time that I understood my world, that I understood how the social and political world impacted me personally. And it changed everything. It was like I found something that was meaningful to me and helped me understand my life and my world. So that was a big turning point. When I think about liberal arts education, and I'm a real proponent and advocate of liberal arts education, what was important to me was that process of learning about my identity. And at the time, and it's still very much like this today, if you want to learn about Arabs, you go to Middle East studies. If you want to learn about Islam, you go to Islamic studies. You can learn a little bit about Latinos. There's Latino studies and ethnic studies. And I was taking ethnic studies courses. I was taking women's studies courses. And I didn't find anything about Arabs or Muslims in the U.S. context. And it felt like a gap to me. It was something I really wanted and I couldn't find. And that very much shaped what would happen later, which is that I did a master's degree at the New School in the 1990s. This was before 9/11. And my thesis was about how Iraqi Americans conceptualize their racial identity. Mm-hmm. I was very curious about how do Arabs interface with the concept of race, because I felt that I grew up and I was not white, but the census category said that I was white. The courses in ethnic studies didn't include Arabs. I felt that Islam was being racialized also, that it was marking us as other.
For sure.
So when I was later on, I was at Stanford for my PhD, and whenever someone would say to me, "Oh, what are you studying?" and I would say racialization of Islam, Muslims, they would say, "Oh, do you know Nadine Naber? You have to meet her. She's a grad student at UC Davis." So as fate would have it, the two of us were hired at the University of Michigan with very similar visions for wanting to see Arab Americans and Muslim Americans discussed within a U.S. ethnic studies context. And so at Michigan, the two of us worked together to create a program that's in American culture, and it's alongside the other ethnic studies units. So it's alongside Native American studies, Latino studies, Asian Pacific Islander studies in that department. And it's one of three that I'm aware of in the world that looks at either Arabs or Muslims in the U.S. context. Mm. And so I'm very passionate about that program. I just left it. Suad Abdul Kabir is the new director of the program, so I'm very happy about that.
Dr. Suad is the new director now.
There is.
Wow. Okay. So, I mean, I knew the connection that you've had, and you've certainly worked with Dr. Suad, who, of course, past guest of the show, and you've worked with Dr. Zarina Graywal, who she and I were together, obviously in different programs, but at the University of Michigan back in the day. Yeah, I mean, that's fascinating. So, Dr. Suad is the new director now that she's at Michigan.
Correct.
And you are now at University of Southern California.
I am.
So, I mean, I'm curious, just anecdotally, because I mean, I as you know, I spent some time in Michigan, and for me, I lived closer to Ann Arbor, but Dearborn wasn't that far, and Zaki got his taste of Dearborn just last month, but
good times.
Had you been to Dearborn prior to your experiences in Michigan, like as a child or anything like that? Because I mean, I think that kind of represents a real fascinating intersection of all of the kind of things you're talking about.
Mm-hmm. So as a child, no.
Okay.
As an undergrad, I went there once.
Really? Okay. Yeah. Just only once.
A friend who lived in Michigan, born and raised in Michigan, was like, "Hey, let me take you to Dearborn," and we went and we ate. And so I saw it once. And then when I moved to Michigan 14 years ago, my first job was at the University of Michigan, Dearborn.
Oh, perfect.
So I lived there for a year in Dearborn. And when I got there, a lot of people said to me, "Oh, this is going to be so amazing for you to live among the Arab and Muslim community." And I was like, "This is weird. I've never done this before."
Yeah.
I grew up in a very multicultural environment. My husband is of African descent. And in Dearborn, it felt weird walking in the street together. It's very segregated. You're white, Arab, or you're black.
That's true.
Very strange experience. I love Dearborn. I've really come to love it over the years. Yeah, it was a weird experience when I when I first moved there, and everyone's assumptions about what an amazing experience it would be for me. But it was quite foreign for me.
Yeah. No, I mean, Detroit, or the greater Detroit area in general, it's just a fascinating sort of, I mean, ethnic study. I mean, whatever you want to call it, because I mean, just how segregated it is, and ghettoized, among racial and what's the word, economic lines, and certainly Dearborn isn't immune from that.
Yes, but then I moved to Ann Arbor, and in my 13 years in Ann Arbor, I noticed an increase in Arab students from Dearborn coming to study at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. So my first year, there's a class that we can maybe talk about later that I've taught for many years called the Middle East in Hollywood. And the first time I taught it, there were 50 students in the class, and 4 were of either Arab or Muslim background. And by the time I left 13 years later, when I would teach that class or any class related to Arabs or Muslims, if there were a class of 50, I'd have at least 30 students who were either Arab or Muslim in the classroom. So I think it was both that the numbers increased on campus, but also word got around that these classes were available.
Yeah. No, I was...
Students.
Sorry?
That were meaningful to those students.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I'd love to talk about some of the classes you teach. I mean, I was just perusing online. I mean, from harems to terrorist representation, or representing the Middle East in Hollywood cinema. I think we definitely want to get into that, and maybe this is probably as good as time as any to do so. But I guess if you could kind of give us the kind of to contextualize the conversation, I think a good place to start would be. Dr. Edward Said's sort of seminal work, Orientalism, and then, probably also Dr. Sheehan's Real Bad Arabs, right? And so how did that sort of inform, your analysis, I guess, of Hollywood? And like you said, I mean, sort of a self-proclaimed pop culture junkie, which I would say is like Zaki is not only a pop culture junkie, but he's like also a curator and he's like the Fred Sanford of pop culture junk as well.
You big dummy!
We need to talk about Zaki's Aladdin article too. I read it.
Oh, I'm honored. Thank you.
I haven't read the review because I wanted to spare myself from. But I know you don't get into spoilers, but I mean, and I know the story. There aren't any spoilers.
You can't spoil that.
That's true. Sorry, I should have done that. My bad. But yeah, I mean, if you maybe in the context of Orientalism, and for our listeners, maybe talk a little bit about what a seminal work that was.
And let me just say that my perspective as a film critic was such that I felt like I can touch on certain aspects of Orientalism, but I don't want to dive down that rabbit hole because that's beyond my remit as a critic, which is why I was so appreciative of your article, because you were really able to dive deep into a lot of stuff that it needs to be part of this conversation and for whatever reason isn't to the degree that it should be.
So regarding Edward Said, I feel like both Edward Said and Jack Shaheen's work is so foundational if you're going to study representations of the Middle East, Arabs and Muslims in U.S. media, which is my area of research. And every class I teach starts with Orientalism, and students find it, especially those of Arab and Muslim background, find the concept so useful because we haven't really had a term that's the term that we have to describe our experience as being an other. So Edward Said describes it as akin to putting on a pair of glasses that distorts your vision when you're talking about the quote unquote East. So it looks exotic, it looks dangerous, and it looks barbaric, and we're unable to see the complexity and the dynamic peoples and cultures and differences that exist there. So that concept is extremely helpful in understanding the particular kind of othering that takes place. And then Jack Shaheen, he wrote this book, Real Bad Arabs, How Hollywood Vilifies a People. It is an encyclopedia that includes almost 1,000 movies that were made by Hollywood from 1897 until 2000. He has another book called Guilty that picks up on after 9/11. And he takes notes on each of these movies and how they represent, particularly Arabs in the Middle East. But when we're talking about Arabs in the Middle East, Muslims are conflated. So it's really hard to pick apart one identity from the other. And he says that out of the over 900 movies he looked at, that he would characterize 12 of them as positive and approximately 50 as neutral. And I think that fact is so important in understanding why a movie like Aladdin matters. That it's not about criticizing one movie. It's about how does this movie make meaning in relation to this history of meaning making about Arabs and Muslims and the Middle East. I got a bunch of comments, and I know when you publish an article, you're not supposed to read the comments. But on the Conversation website,
not going down the rabbit hole of the comment section of any internet article, right?
Exactly. But on the Conversation website, whenever there's a comment posted, I get an email about it.
Oh my gosh.
And so I've been reading these comments, and many people have said that I'm overly sensitive and that it's just a movie. And a lot of people feel that way. It's just a movie. Why so much criticism and so much weight on this one movie? And I think that what's missed with that point of view is that it's not about one movie, but about how one movie is in conversation and perpetuating a particular perspective and narrative in relation to a history of, in this case, Orientalism, or the same kind of Orientalist message repeated over and over again. So it's not that Aladdin is good or bad or they're horrible people. It's about how is Aladdin perpetuating the same perspective about the Middle East as exotic, and what is that impact on people's point of view? One commenter actually said, I'm going to watch the movie and I'm not going to think that Arabs are like that. It's fantasy. And I get that too, but we're all it's going to influence all of us because it's confirming something again.
It's fantasy until you read like a statistic where like 40% of Republicans wanted to bomb Agrabah or something. Am I right?
Yeah.
So
they're like, we can't let the Cave of Wonders fall into the wrong hands. Yeah. The whole notion of you're being sensitive, I always find that fascinating because I've gotten my share of that. And almost without exception, it's people from outside the culture that is being critiqued who are deigning to say, well, this is how this culture that is not mine should be thought of. Like, you who are part of this culture, you need to get over yourself. And that, to me, is what is so, like, the mindset that leads to someone saying that, that's not racist. Oh, that's not sexist. Like, well, you don't know. You're not part of the group. Like, why are you unwilling to even have the conversation or entertain the possibility that this might potentially be problematic?
That comment is not only minimizing and dismissive, but it shows that people are unaware of the history that we're dealing with. So it's akin to, sometimes in class, I have a class called Race and Mixed Race. We talk about affirmative action. And a lot of students say, why would we do affirmative action? It's unfair. And then once they learn about the history, they're like, oh, I get it now. But without understanding the larger historical context, some things don't really make sense. Why would you be upset about that? And then we get this minimizing impulse. But if Jack Shaheen did this research and showed us that 900 movies, which came out of Hollywood, are stereotyping Arabs and Muslims and the Middle East, then Aladdin matters. And if only 12 says are positive, we have a huge problem. And it's coming out in our public opinion polls. It's coming out with the poll that you cited. It was both Republicans and Democrats saying that, to varying degrees, that Agrabah should be bombed. And it reminds me actually of the work of one of my colleagues at the University of Michigan, Maniba Salim. She's a social psychologist, and she did a study to find out the extent to which media influences our perceptions, particularly around Muslims. And she found that when viewers watch stories about Muslims as terrorists repeatedly, they are more likely to support policies that are repressive against Muslims, that include invading Muslim countries and also restricting civil liberties on Muslim rights in the United States. And she found that with neutral images and positive images, that trend was diminished. So there's a huge relationship that many people like to deny.
What you just said reminds me of my thesis, my master's thesis. I wrote a thesis. The title is From the Delta Force to Lost, looking at the portrayal of Middle Eastern characters post 9/11 specifically. And my contention in the piece was that the character of, what was his name? Saeed on Lost was like one of the best, the most positive Muslim character that had ever been seen on American television up to that point, which is sad, obviously, because he is a torturer and he's this and that, but he was also multi-layered and he was human, and that played out in the sense of, both my brother and my dad told the same story to me of being on a trip, and both of their names is Syed, so people would see their name and say, "Oh, Syed, like Syed on Lost. Oh, he's so great. I love Syed." And what a concept,
Yeah, so they got positive feedback because of that character.
That's right. I think, and I certainly want to talk more about Aladdin, but maybe, and I know this is a really difficult task. I mean, like you said, it's Ed Sheehan talked about, or I'm sorry, Dr. Jack Sheehan's book analyzes over 900 films. I mean, but if you could kind of maybe give us, in your perspective, how Hollywood has historically, seen or depicted, the Middle East and Muslims and Arabs in that context, because it begins with sort of the exotic or the unknown or the barbaric, but then and certainly barbaric isn't by any means positive, but I would, one at least could argue that when the exotic, or if it's seen as being mysterious, that can go either way. But I mean, certainly it's reductionist, but it's nonetheless, it's not as blatantly obviously negative as being depicted as a mass murderer or terrorist or madman. So where has what are the contours of that representation that Jack Sheehan talks about in Hollywood?
So from early cinema, the late 1800s until roughly the 1940s and 1950s, with the foundation of the State of Israel, and later with the Arab-Israeli War in 1967, the early movies portray the Middle East as this exotic locale. It's romantic, it's exciting, it's dangerous, but in a romantic way. And Jack Sheehan's work shows this. He refers to belly dancers, bombers, and billionaires. That was what he would say to describe basically the history of stereotypes. But a lot of belly dancers and harem girls, and storylines where the Arabs or Muslims in the harem need to be saved by a white man. And the other piece of scholarship that I teach on this topic that's been very influential for my own work is Ella Shohat and Robert Stamm book, Unthinking Eurocentrism, Multiculturalism, and the Media. And they have a chapter where they talk about different tropes or storylines that are common in films about the Middle East. So we get stories about mummies, we get stories about the rape and rescue fantasy, we get stories about the desert. The Desert Odyssey is what they refer to it as. And so we have these packages of how we get stories about the Middle East. And they argue that these early movies, as fun and romantic and silly as they may seem, are actually legitimizing the logic that justifies colonialism. That's so right. By projecting the Middle East as backwards, it is justifying the idea that the West needs to go in there and help to civilize or help to save. And so even the most mundane seeming movies contribute to that particular kind of logic. And when those movies were being produced in the earlier period, parts of the Middle East were in fact colonized by Europe. So the next time period, and this I usually refer to Melanie McAllister's book called Epic Encounters. And she writes about how the Middle East became meaningful to Americans from 1945 to the present. And she takes us in her book through various political turning points. So we have the Arab-Israeli War in 1967 as introducing the terrorist stereotype that we're all very familiar with. So in seeing Palestinians, we don't get the Palestinian point of view. They're terrorists, and at first they're out to get Israelis and Jews, and later on it's a threat also to the United States.
So, I mean, as a child, and Zaki mentioned this movie in particular, but like Delta Force is probably like one of the most blatant examples of that. But is there a movie that you can think of that predates even Delta Force? I mean, both you guys, it's probably a question for you as well, Zaki.
There's a movie I teach called Black Sunday, and it's from the 1970s, and it has a Palestinian woman terrorist, and she's coming to the United States to blow up the Super Bowl.
Wow.
And so that's one of the earlier ones. Actually, he obviously writes about that since he writes about everything. And the actress is a German-Swiss actress, so she has this weird accent that's not Arab, that's just foreign.
Just foreign, right?
Yeah. Zaki, did any come to your mind?
I'm thinking. I mean, to me, certainly, I really point to the Delta Force as a demarcation point because of how egregious and excessive it was.
And when was that?
That was like 85, I want to say, okay. 85 or 86.
Mm-hmm.
And, that's Golan Globus. Menachem Golan, Yoram Globus, there were these two producers out of Israel. So there was a clear intent in that film depicting Muslim terrorists a specific way.
Isn't there like a documentary about those guys?
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah.
It's Electric Boogaloo.
That's right.
It's about Golan Globus. Yeah, those guys, I mean, they were all around in the 80s. They made all the crap in the 80s, basically, right? Yeah. But the Delta Force, there was something insidious about it because I remember being 6 or 7, which is, by the way, too young to watch a movie like that. But I remember watching it, being like, "Oh, it's awesome! Chuck Norris is great. Lee Marvin's awesome." And here you've got, by the beard of the prophet or whatever, all the cliches. And man, I mean, that did a number. I look at the Delta Force as like an impact crater for the next, decade and change. That really shaped how Muslim characters are portrayed.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, how Muslim characters are portrayed, and then also the sort of helpless, Jewish victims, right, on the plane. Right, because I remember. I think images come to mind of like the woman who had to hide her Star of David necklace or something. I mean, pendant.
It's what's funny is even more than that because yes, it's playing on obviously the he even said, "Oh, they're gonna do another Holocaust." I mean, it's insidious when you use that type of language, right? But beyond that, it's this notion of you equip your lead characters with righteous vengeance. Because no matter what they do, we as the audience are okay with because of what the bad guys have done, right? And you see Chuck Norris, he's got this stupid like rocket powering motorcycle or whatever. And my point is, I draw a straight line between that movie to like 2-3 years ago, London Has Fallen. Mm-hmm. Which is, what's his name? Gerard Butler is Mike Banning, Secret Service agent Mike Banning. And the movie constructs this ridiculous scenario where you have Muslim terrorists manage to, they assassinate like every world leader. And you say, well, that just could not happen. There's just no scenario where that matches what the movie constructs. But you have to do this really fantastical, ridiculous thing in order to stack the deck so that so that Gerard Butler can go after these people. And however, he has a line where he's beating up on these bad guys and he says, "Go back to Afghanistan." Mm-hmm. Right? And I'm sitting there in the theater watching this and I'm looking around at the people around me like, are you serious with this? Yeah. And we haven't come that far at all. That's my point. Because there is a ready and waiting audience for that type of quote unquote entertainment.
Now, isn't that movie filled? Isn't that the one with the diabetes line that you just cracked up on?
No, that's White House Down.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
I always get those two.
Which
confused.
is the better movie about terrorists taking over.
But aren't
the White
those two
House.
Movies kind of like Armageddon and Deep Impact?
That's very apt.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh.
Anyway, we're going on a tangent here.
Yes.
So you said that the 1970s movie Black Sunday came to mind. And so. We were talking about, and then is there a turning point? I mean, I would imagine probably 9/11.
So the other moments that Melanie McAllister mentioned is the 1973 Arab oil embargo, where we get the rich Arab oil sheik stereotype, the 1979 Iran hostage crisis, where we get this conflation of Arab, Muslim, Iran, and threatening, but also a threat to the United States. And then Gulf War, we actually get a multicultural moment. And this is when we have the siege with Tony Shalhoub as the quote-unquote good Muslim, good Arab American, and Three Kings is the other film where you have a multicultural military and also a quote-unquote good Iraqi who helps them escape Iraq. So that's a turning point. And then the book that I wrote, Arabs and Muslims in the Media, looks at what happens after 9/11. And what I argue in the book is that the quote-unquote positive becomes standardized. And I think that that's changing now with films like London is Falling, with movies like, or TV shows like Bodyguard and Jack Ryan, that there's a bit of a shift happening now in the Trump era. But after 9/11 and leading up to the Obama era, people were saying post-race, we're in this post-race era. And what we would have is a story about terrorism. And then the writers and producers would include usually a patriotic Arab or Muslim American who's willing to fight and die for the United States. And it seemed like this character was there so that they can say, we're not perpetuating the stereotype.
Right.
We're diffusing it. Look, there was a good one in there. They're not all bad. We're making this distinction. And in the book, I'm arguing that it's really an illusion and it's really not doing anything for us. Because A, how can it do anything for us if the context is still terrorism? And B, the idea of who's patriotic is very narrow.
That's right.
And how we define patriotism. I mean, this was my problem with The Siege, with Tony Shalhoub.
Well, sorry, I don't want to cut you off, but I mean, I think because I definitely want to draw, because I think in your book gets into this, and I think The Siege and Tony Shalhoub's character would be a great starting point, because you talk about how post 9/11, what you imagined would be the scenario is that, representation would be the sort of continuing of the Arab as or Muslim as terrorist trope. And yet, what you saw was representation being sympathetic. However, within the sort of context of the two, I guess, of these two new tropes, which is the patriotic Arab or the patriotic American Muslim, and then the victimized Muslim. Right. And both, of course, being reductionist in their own ways. So I just wanted to kind of interject that, because I think Tony Shalhoub is a great, Tony Shalhoub's character. I have nothing against
I'm sure Tony Shalhoub is a lovely person too.
That's right.
I love Monk.
I love Monk too. Thank you. And I loved him on Wings. Anyway,
well, his character is Farouk Haddad.
Okay. I haven't seen
but he's Frank.
Okay.
And we know he's a good guy because he drinks and he kind of cheats on his wife, and and this was my beef. Now I went and saw the press screening of The Siege, fall of '98. I was in college. I was in community college. I was doing movie reviews for my school newspaper. And
meanwhile, I was outside handing out pamphlets, asking people to boycott the film.
Well, that
I remember I was one of those guys. So I was for that, and also Executive Decision.
Well, and Executive Decision.
How about True Lies?
And True Lies that was 94, right? Yeah. So I mean, the thing is that what we just said about Tony Shalhoub's character and what you said, it's echoed in Roger Ebert's review of Executive Decision. So you're not the only one, you're not off on an island making these observations. Here's Ebert talking about Executive Decision, where he says the terrorist, whose name is Hasan, reveals that his original demands were only a cover for his real plans. A moderate among his followers steps forwards and shouts, "This has nothing to do with Islam," and is shot. His function is to get the filmmakers off the hook. Hasan is a fanatic, see, and not to be taken as typical of his co-religionists. Roger Ebert made that observation in 1996.
Amazing.
So
in my book, I say that this became standard after 9/11, but that there are precedents. So that's a great example. That's 1996. I didn't know about that one. But The Siege, 1998. Three Kings, 1991. Even Not Without My Daughter.
Oh, sure.
1991 is Not Without My Daughter. 1999 is Three Kings.
Three Kings, yeah.
But they all have that character who's in there to diffuse the stereotype. And then after 9/11, it was like 95% of the media that came out about terrorism with an Arab or Muslim terrorist had that character. So it became expected and standard. And from the point of view, probably of the movie executive, they're trying to be sensitive, or they're trying to be more complex. A lot of the terrorists had a backstory. They weren't two-dimensional anymore. But ultimately, I didn't see these efforts as making much of a difference, and I was often confused about whether or not the motive was to avoid the Council on American Islamic Relations or the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee being on their case, or whether they were genuinely trying to do something different.
That's fascinating because, and then even a movie like Zero Dark 30 comes to mind, right? Where, and Zaki and I have talked about this as, a positive portrayal, because you obviously you've got what the whole theme of the plot of the movie is, but then you've got the CIA, he's kind of high in the CIA.
Yeah, he's
and they walk into his office and they see him like finishing or concluding his prayer. And there's no mention of him being Muslim or anything like that.
I mean, he's like a generic looking white guy, for lack of a...
Oh yeah, that's right.
Right. He's not, visibly Muslim, quote unquote.
So now, how would you characterize that kind of a character? I mean, he's no Tony Shalhoub because, he's just sort of a minor character in the film. And then they're also not sort of, to borrow an expression, Zaki, like they're not lampshading the fact that, he's Muslim, yet it's shown. But is that kind of another example of that sort of the patriotic American Muslim that you speak of?
So I did watch Zero Dark 30, but it's been a long time. But is he a good character?
He's a neutral character, I would say. I mean, he's in it for like a minute and a half. Essentially, the CIA torturer, who's played by Jason Clarke, at one point he goes and has a meeting with this guy, and the guy is like doing sujood, and then he folds up his prayer rug and he's like, "Oh, sit down," But the guy is, by all appearances, a typical white guy.
Yep. So to me, that is part of the trend, which is trying to do something interesting and complex. So look, we have a white guy who's Muslim, and he's in the background, and he's supposed to diffuse it's proving that they're not stereotyping, but it's such a small gesture. It's proving that they're aware that not all Arabs are Muslims and Muslims are Arabs. And so a lot of that has taken place since 9/11, and it's usually a pretty minor character, or if it's a supporting character, they're going to be killed to prove that they support the United States, like in Homeland with the Farah Tarazi character. I don't know if you've seen Homeland. She's Iranian, she's Muslim, she's working for the CIA, and her sole purpose is to be killed by a terrorist, of course, to prove that she is a patriotic American.
I haven't seen Homeland. We've had Kamran Pasha on. What was the show he was involved with? I mean, is that
Splinter Cell.
Splinter Cell. Okay, I wonder if
Sleeper Cell. Sorry.
I don't know if you're familiar with that show.
I am familiar with Sleeper Cell.
And any thoughts there? I mean, I haven't seen it. I don't.
Kamran has plenty of critiques, but by the way, I mean,
right.
Yeah, we need to have him back.
That's right. Yeah.
I mean, before you comment, Professor, I mean, the reality that I get from talking to Muslim friends and colleagues who work in the industry is this: it's like we're there, and they don't come to us. They don't ask us. There's no desire to actually make us part of the process. And that's an ongoing concern even now.
I believe it. Sleeper Cell had a diverse cast of Muslims. It wasn't about Arab Muslim, Muslim Arab. It was, it did that. But, it was about terrorism. And the lead terrorist was played by Oded Fehr, who's Israeli.
Yeah.
And then Darwin Al-Said was the name of the FBI agent who goes undercover, and he's Muslim, African-American. And he's in that same character of the patriotic Muslim who's going to infiltrate and stop terrorism.
And I think one other movie to mention, because we talk about African-American Muslim representation, which is, I think it's called The Patriot. It's been a while since I saw it. Is that Don Cheadle? What's that movie?
No, it's...
not The Patriot.
Traitor.
Sorry.
The exact opposite of Patriot. the literal opposite.
I haven't seen that one in a long time too.
I don't remember it.
I don't remember it, but I mean, it's...
Well, there's this Dick Wolf show right now, FBI, where one of the lead characters is a Muslim FBI agent. And that, I haven't watched the show, but that would seem to fall right into...
Quantico had a Muslim agent.
Yes.
Yeah,
a hijabi too, I think.
That's right, yeah.
Yep.
Like a Muslim, and I don't mean hijabi, I did like Muslim woman, more than just, yeah. So...
One wore the hijab, the other did not.
Right.
Yes,
right. Was
right.
that
on Quantico?
Unquantic. Was that, what's her name? The Bollywood actress? Or was it?
No.
She's different.
Different.
Okay.
Yeah.
Priyanka Chopra.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So the you've got these two sort of tropes, right, of the patriotic American Muslim and the victimized Muslim, and you argue that, I mean, while we can certainly glean certain maybe positive or sympathetic images from these two tropes or feelings that we get when we see characters like that, however, the problem being, again, it's still within the sort of or within the context, or I think what you describe as sort of the logics of terrorism or the national security apparatus.
So basically, how much progress is it if we're understanding Arab and Muslim identities as good or bad in relation to terrorism? So, and I apply the same kind of argument to Aladdin, which I do think there are a lot of improvements, but ultimately the question is, how much progress is it when the Orientalist framework remains? And so my main argument about Aladdin is that it seems to me that movie executives today believe that a good portrayal is going back to the Orientalism of the 1920s. That seems harmless. It's exotic, it's fun, it's romantic. And so if we do 1920s Orientalism, that must be progress because we're not portraying them as terrorists. So moving away from terrorism to this new improved thing, but it's not really new and improved, it's the same old thing. And it's not just Aladdin. So the other movies that come to mind include Hidalgo from 2004.
Yeah. Which is Zaki, you interviewed both the director and
Viggo Mortensen.
Yeah, just I don't know if you know that. Yeah,
I don't. I'd love to hear about it.
Yeah, it was like 15 years ago.
You should talk about that.
Yeah, sure.
Because I don't know if you I don't think you actually talked about it on this podcast. So yeah,
no.
Yeah. Anyway, please. Go.
So Hidalgo is one in this category about a cowboy who's part Native American who goes to the Middle East for a race in the desert with his horse, and it includes him saving the Sheikh's daughter from the
played by Omar Sharif.
Correct.
Yeah.
I think one of his last
roles. Yep.
Salmon fishing in the Yemen, 2011. I don't know if you've seen that one.
Yeah,
I haven't.
Another one. It's a sweet movie, and also it's about bringing salmon fishing to Yemen, hiring this British company to do it. And while in Yemen, there's a lot of bandits and terrorists threatening the main Sheikh character. And then Victoria and Abdul from 2017.
Oh, yeah.
Which has a criticism of racism and Islamophobia embedded in the movie. And at the same time, Abdul is infantilized, otherized, and he's not a fully developed person.
Yeah.
So I mentioned in my op-ed that Aladdin is different from these in the sense that it doesn't revolve around a white protagonist, where these others are revolving around a white protagonist. But that
who kind of comes to save the day, like. And I'm of those movies that you mentioned, I've only seen Hidalgo, but I imagine that being kind of representative of what you're talking about.
Yes. So the idea being
white
that
savior
Orientalism is supposedly good now, better, and I'm questioning that framework. And how much progress can you really make in an Orientalist framework?
What I find fascinating, one of the other things that you mentioned and was one of your talks where you draw kind of a parallel between this representation of the good Muslim, patriotic Muslim, and the, I guess, maybe, 1940s, 50s, or maybe even earlier portrayal of the black mammy female character, the black female character as being good, a good representation, but nonetheless it sort of furthered this idea that black women were comfortable and okay with being servants.
Right. So the ultimate question is, what kinds of logics are being perpetuated through these images? So in the case of the mammy, it might seem to some people as harmless, but is perpetuating the idea of black women as servants and not as equal. And with the patriot, it's perpetuating the idea that the only good Arab or Muslim is the one that's willing to fight and die for the United States. And so the rest are bad unless they prove themselves otherwise. And there's a really high bar here for how to really prove that you are one of us.
And you can draw a corollary between that to, any time there's any kind of a terrorist act or whatever that happens overseas, there's that we see it online, like, oh, why aren't Muslims condemning this? Why don't you say something about this? And again, it goes to that high bar that you've set where every person who identifies with that culture is expected to take ownership of all the pluses and all the minuses of that culture, or all the minuses and maybe the pluses. We'll see. We'll decide that.
Right. Exactly.
So the trend that you're identifying is, well, I don't know if it's a trend, but with a movie like Aladdin, or the live remake, I should say, live action remake of Aladdin, it's this kind of return to the Orientalism of the 1920s, depicted in Hollywood. But then you also mentioned something earlier, which was this the like with shows like Jack Ryan, and maybe, I don't know if Homeland was another example of that, where. Like, what is a direction or a trend that you see with shows like that? And I only mention Jack Ryan in particular because, past guest of the show, Omar Muzaffar, at least in some capacity, was involved as an advisor.
And by the way, Mina Masood was on Jack Ryan.
Oh, okay, yeah. Okay. So I'm not familiar. I haven't watched a single episode.
He's like one of the FBI people.
I like Jack. Is it Jack? Or is it, what's his name? The lead character, the lead actor.
John Krasinski.
John Krasinski. Thank you. Yeah.
Gramps.
I know. Yeah. So I'm sorry. So are you? What do you see with that kind of like? What do you see in that trend?
So I feel like when I watched London is Falling, I thought, oh, this trend that I'm following doesn't hold across the board anymore, because London is Falling is not making an effort to include this positive character. It was very explicit. They're all bad and terrorists. There was this one brown person who was part of the, I don't remember if it's FBI, CIA government group, but he was sort of nameless and in the background. But I don't know if you remember the character, but there was this one brown person in the group.
I barely remember the movie.
Nondescript, ethnically ambiguous brown person.
Exactly. And for Jack Ryan, Mina Masood plays that role.
Yeah.
He's a minor character. You don't know much about him, but he's there.
He's with Jack Ryan in the CIA.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
And the other... So when I look at these films that seem a little bit distinct from this real effort, look, there's a good one. It makes me think that it's reflective of where we are today in terms of Muslim ban, Brexit, Trump era, which is a much more explicit moment than the Obama era where everyone was celebrating this post-race thing. Bodyguard is the other one. I don't know if you've seen Bodyguard.
No, but I know of what you speak, yeah.
The television show, not the Kevin...
Not the Kevin
Sorry,
Costner movie
again, Gramps.
from 1992.
Yeah, again, Gramps. Yeah. Sorry.
The new one.
The new one, got it. So, I think... one of the other concepts that you talk about is this idea of a simplified, complex representation. Is that an example, like this example of the good, of the good character there to offset the bad representation? Is that what, or maybe you could just talk about what you mean and or define as the simplified, complex representations that you hope to see. Yeah.
As you know, academics love to create terms.
Well, you're on a podcast called Diffused Congruence, which
that's true. I fit in.
So we are guilty of the same.
I was trying to create a term to capture the phenomenon of, if you're watching a movie and it's a terrorist theme, you can expect one of a number of things to happen.
Okay,
and that is a trend. And so it including the patriotic Arab or Muslim. It includes the victimized one, who is significant because, as you both were commenting with Delta Force, you celebrate when the evil Arab or evil Muslim are killed. So to have the opportunity to feel bad, I feel so bad, this innocent Muslim is facing hate crimes, it's significant. It's limited, but it's significant. So that's another example of simplified, complex representations. Other examples are giving the terrorist a backstory. So in Sleeper Cell, for example, we see the terrorist, he has a wife, he has a kid. We see a fuller picture of his life. In Jack Ryan, actually, there's a backstory with why the terrorists became terrorists, and it's because the U.S. Dropped a drone and killed their family. It's easily forgettable, but it's mentioned. So the idea is that writers and producers are trying to make more complex storylines, but when you analyze them as much as I have, you can predict them. They are formulaic, and ultimately they're very simple. So if you watch TV with me and we're on this theme, I can tell you what's going to happen, and it's not fun to watch TV with me anymore.
Yeah, my wife says the same thing to me.
Probably for other reasons, but yeah. No, and I want to shift. I definitely want to talk about, because I think there's two other areas of your academic work that I do want to focus on. One being Islamophobia, the other being the as guest curator of the online exhibit. But I guess before we shift from the conversation around Arab and Muslim representation, because I think one of the other things you do that I have also heard you talk about, and perhaps we can now would be a good time to maybe delve, the two of you, into a conversation around Aladdin in more detail, which is where what are examples of sort of good representation where it's not within the context of terrorism or the national security apparatus. And I know you, Dr. Alsultany, you've talked about a character on Community. Now, a show I'm not familiar with, but I know Zaki is a huge fan of. So I'm going to just leave it to you two. But I guess the character of Ahmed, played by
Danny Pudi.
Danny Pudi, who
is in
we should mention was on
Khan's
Lena Khan's Tiger Hunter, who we've had Lena on the show, and I think. And I would love to actually your comment. Sorry, I'm kind of all over the place here, but because I think the Tiger Hunter juxtaposed with, say, a movie like The Big Sick, right, mm-hmm. where you've got this sort of immigrant story, but yet they're very different. Because I think there's another trend that I saw, at least in that movie, like whether it's The Big Sick, but also in shows like Aziz Ansari, who doesn't profess to be a Muslim, but in his show, I forget, Master of None. What is it called?
Master of None.
Yeah, Master of None, where it's this kind of trope of the Arab Muslim white girlfriend, kind of scenario. Maybe talk a little bit about that. But I mean, I know I've thrown a lot at you, but I guess starting with Ahmed. There you go.
Professor, please.
Yes. Okay. And before we conclude the show, we should probably talk about a few things that are good about Aladdin.
Yeah, no, like I said, I definitely want to focus on that. And then, not wrapping it, because I do definitely want to talk about your work with Islamophobia, as well as your work as guest curator of the online exhibit. Mm-hmm.
So I think there are many examples out there of representations that have potential. I think that
and what makes them good, perhaps, would be a good,
Yeah, so let's say Community. I like Ahmed. Though there is, and Zaki, you might remember this, there is a very stereotypical episode with his family in the stand. Okay, so they do flop on that episode. But in general, Ahmed is this really weird guy. He's a nerd. He's into pop culture, and he's Palestinian. And he's not weird because he's Palestinian. He's just a weird guy. So I like Ahmed because of that. It's unusual to see that kind of character.
Isn't there a similar Indian character on The Big Bang Theory?
Another
show I don't watch.
He's extremely stereotypical.
Oh, is he? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I don't watch that show, but
right.
I can't imagine that the wider Indian audience would be happy with the character that Kunal Nair
What about that show, Fresh Off the Boat, I think?
Yes.
Okay. But there's a Muslim character there as well, right?
That I don't know. I don't watch the show, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. Anyway, please continue.
After 9/11, Whoopi Goldberg had a sitcom called Whoopi, and she had a character, Nassim, Candyman.
Yeah.
That was really cute. Little Mosque on the Prairie. Right now there's a lot of discussion around Rami, and I do like Rami.
That's the Hulu series,
right? I've heard a lot about it, wanting to watch it. We actually had Zarka. What's her name? Zarka on the show. Who was,
I saw that Little Mosque. Yeah, Zarka Nawaz.
That's right. Rami, fascinating because we've had Azhar Usman on the show, who's really close friends with Rami, and then of course a lot of people didn't know anything about Rami Youssef as a comedian until this Hulu show, which everyone's talking about. Have you watched it, and any thoughts there?
I have watched Rami. I have a lot of thoughts.
Okay. Well, maybe we'll leave that for another conversation then.
Okay.
But, yeah.
The one thing I'll say is the professor. This is something we talked about the other day.
Yeah.
Where it's not as easy as saying it's all bad or it's all good. It's there's aspects of all of these things where you can look at and say, well, that's progress. And that's a good thing, and that's a step forward. And, I've told the story a gazillion times. I don't think I've ever told this on this show. But, I'm watching Star Trek Deep Space Nine with my kids. I started watching that a couple years ago, and there was the character played by Siddiq Al-Fadl, his screen name is Alexander Siddiq, and his character is Dr. Bashir. And my second son, who was 8 at the time, I said to my boys, I was like, "Oh, that's Dr. Bashir," and my son says, "That's his name. That's his name on the show," and
he got excited.
He got excited by that, and this is an 8-year-old kid who's never seen that. Just something as simple as that, So for me, even small steps forward, I don't undervalue those because I realize that for that 8-year-old, it's meaningful and it's valuable.
Well, I think of like Rogue One and my daughter's reaction seeing Riz Ahmed's name on the screen. We know when the Star Wars credits start, and just her excitement of seeing Ahmed on the big screen. It's her last name, her own last name.
Yeah. So when we look at something like Aladdin, that was when our press screening ended. I turned to my colleague and I was like, well, it's amazing that you have a movie with almost entirely unknown brown people. Will Smith is known, I guess, but few people know him. There was no white star that they needed to like anchor the movie. That's a big deal. And it wasn't that long ago. 9 years ago, the Prince of Persia was Jake, not Persian Gyllenhaal.
Correct.
Right? And same studio. That was Disney. That was not that long ago, And what's funny is had that movie come out today, there's no way it would have been made that way. That's progress. The fact that they made an effort to cast, in a very broad sense, ethnically appropriate actors for the roles. That's a good thing. I have my issues with the film. I'm not crazy about the movie, but that's a big deal. And the fact that it opened as well as it did, that's a big deal because it means there's more likelihood of being willing to take a chance on ensembles that are more reflective of the diversity of the world we live in. That's a big deal.
I agree. I think that the biggest improvements in Aladdin is the casting.
Yes.
And casting Mina Massoud. And I think one of you said that a 16-year-old went to see it. Did you say that?
My daughter, yeah. She
so
liked it.
Yeah, I think it's significant that, young girls and boys are going to have a crush on Mina Massoud. I think that's very meaningful. Because we don't have that, so I think
right, and we shouldn't. We should be cognizant of those sort of changes, even as subtle as they are. And I think a point that you make, which is, you mentioned this about good and bad. Like, by you, I'm sorry, I'm pointing to Zaki here, but because you talk about
Stop
this,
pointing at me,
Professor Alsultany, which is this idea that that a good bad analysis isn't sufficient, but rather we need to be looking at sort of the logics, right, that are created with these representations.
Right. I say that in my class all the time. That if we ask, "Is this movie good or bad? Is the representation good or bad?" then the conversation's over. It's good or it's bad.
Yeah.
But if we ask, what are the logics? What are the logics that are being perpetuated? What are the meanings that are being produced about these identities? It offers a lot more information. So, we might look at Aladdin and say, it's good. It's not about terrorism. And, it's about the exotic East. It's not that bad. But if we think about the larger historical context and what it means to return to a very limited trope, then we can see the problems with it. But at the same time, as we're trying to do here, acknowledge the progress that has been made, especially around the casting. What I find interesting is that the movie got a lot of negative reviews in Entertainment Weekly and the New York Times. They were giving grades of like a C-. And then I was getting these nasty comments about how I'm overly sensitive. And I thought, my review is actually, I think it's a really fun movie. I'm just criticizing it in the context of the history of representations. I'm not giving it a C- based on acting and graphics as others are.
My job.
I haven't been as like I haven't been as in tune to social media as I normally am, but like we met, and I don't want to misquote her, so I'm just going to just like I think, and I was going to ask you because you are you've worked with Dr. Suad. She posted something or mentioned something about Aladdin. I mean, I'm sorry, of Will Smith playing the genie.
He's the magical Negro. He's literally the magical Negro in the movie. That was her critique.
Now, is that a sort of?
That's a trope.
Okay,
right? It's Key and Peele did a very funny takeoff on that, where they had two dueling magical Negroes, but the idea, in a very broad sense, and Professor, correct me if I'm misstating this, but the idea, it's the wise black person who doesn't have agency in the story except to give wisdom to the white lead character. So the best, if we're talking about Will Smith
played
is Bagger Vance. So
thank you.
That's like the prototypical example of that. Yeah.
I think Spike Lee created the term in the 1990s to refer to a trend of, I guess, how Hollywood thought a positive representation, what that looked like.
It's a Green Book or Driving Miss Daisy, same idea. Those are both magical Negro stories.
Or The Help.
The Help, there's another one, yeah.
Or that mammy figure we were talking about a while ago.
Right, because when you mentioned the mammy figure, I thought of The Help in terms of modern examples, and then The Butler. Both movies I haven't seen, but I mean, they just came to mind. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner could be reflective of that to some extent. Because it's not Sidney Poitier's story, it's what's his name's story, right? The dad. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Like, so these are, again, and there's a great Key and Peele sketch, which of course those guys, who better to poke holes in these types of tropes than those guys.
So a valid point that like Dr. Swad is raising with the casting of Will Smith.
I'll be very honest, that wasn't an in that I would have thought of, but that's the benefit of being Dr. Swad and having her experience. She's going to look at things from a very specific perspective, and I read her critique and I was like, wow, I hadn't thought of that.
Yes. But her concern is that there's only one black character with a speaking role, and that he plays the role of the magical Negro, and that in most films he's there to serve the white person. In this case, is to serve Aladdin, brown person. And for me, actually, when I was watching the film, I did feel a little bit uncomfortable with the genie is trapped. He's a slave. He's waiting to be free, and it had a lot of resonance for me since Will Smith is African American. Resonance to slavery in the United States, I couldn't help but go there, and so I did feel a little bit weird, but no one else seems to.
Well, care. I think I think the reason that, as you say, maybe not as many people are reading into that is because the role as constructed is Will Smith as Will Smith. So in other words, he is bigger than the movie that he's in, at least insofar as the character. And the distinction I would draw is, for example, The Legend of Bagger Vance, which is very much, it's the, we feeling sick, boss, like that kind of, that, he comes off as more positioned under, know. So I think for me personally, that's the reason it didn't occur to me until I read Dr. Swad's.
It's true. He's very Will Smith.
He's very Will Smith.
I think he does a great job as the genie.
Yeah.
He brings a lot of fun to the movie.
I definitely agree with that, yeah.
I mean, how do you feel Robin Williams, right? And just,
yeah,
obviously a cartoon character. But
you get somebody who's not even going to make you think of that necessarily. And, when he does the song, Prince Ali, in the film, he has a line where he's like, say your Friday salam or something like that. And I've seen people get real excited about that.
My daughter actually pointed that out.
And again, this is what I'm saying. Yeah. On the one hand, I'm like, all right, guys,
because she knows the Sunday salam line.
That's the thing, right? Is I'm on one level, I'm like, all right, guys, let's settle down. It's one word. Let's get. But then again, I'm like, but you know what? I need to remember, I'm not the main audience. It's a lot of kids. It's a lot of people. It's a lot of people who don't know anything about this, whose understanding will be expanded, and that's valid and important as well. Mm-hmm. The question is, in my opinion, is Aladdin the end of our journey, or is it, does it signal, well, we got more places to go?
And as you point out in your article that I wanted to hear you talk about.
Oh, thank you.
You asked, why Aladdin? And you said it's about the money at the end of the day. Why would Disney want to do Aladdin?
Yeah, I mean, this is I've had this conversation a few times where people are getting very upset with me. Why isn't it historically accurate? And I'm like, first of all, I didn't make the movie. I didn't greenlight it. I don't know if you read my review. I gave it a negative review, but that was my point. And I think I said this at the top. Disney wanted to be accurate to 1992. That's the history they care about evoking, you know. It's and so you're boxed in, and this is the same problem they have with Beauty and the Beast. This with Dumbo, whatever. It's like if there's a million versions of Beauty and the Beast, but when you say Disney's Beauty and the Beast, it's got to look a certain way. It's got to have it's got to sound a certain way. Well, the same thing with Aladdin. You say Disney's Aladdin, that needs to be Disney's Aladdin. It's got to have Abu the monkey. It's got to have the magic carpet. You know, the stuff specifically in that film. So. That's a longer arc of conversation we need to have about, how is Hollywood portraying Middle Eastern cultures? But insofar as this specific film, they are boxed in by the precedent that was set, 25 years ago, 27 years ago, whenever that movie came out. When did it come out? 92. But that's me,
I agree.
So, I mean, I again, and we can keep talking about this, and this has been a fascinating conversation. But some of the other projects that you're also involved with, maybe we can just sort of mention that briefly, and then we can probably wrap conclude the conversation.
Okay. Sounds good.
I didn't get to do a lot of reading on it, but I mean, your work as the guest curator for this online exhibit. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the online exhibit and where people can check that out.
Yeah, so it's www.arabstereotypes.org, and I worked with the Arab American National Museum to create an online exhibit on both the history of stereotyping, and then there's the section that the museum curated about who are Arab Americans. So the idea was to have something accessible to high school teachers and to the public to learn about what is Orientalism and what is this history of stereotyping, why does it matter? And so we put that together. We had a moment where we were testing the ideas, and a lot of the people who gave us feedback said that they wanted to know who Arab Americans are. So the website developed into having two sections, one about who are Arab Americans and the other about the history of stereotyping. And it has a section also about who else has been in other, to really make the point that stereotyping is not unique to the Arab American community.
Right.
And to look at examples throughout history, and particularly in the U.S., of other groups that have been othered. Wonderful.
And then I guess, finally, I mean, and again, this is just a way of teasing, a conversation that we hope to have you back on the show in the future to talk about. But, I know one of the other projects that you are involved with, or another part of your study, is Islamophobia. And I know that's where you've done a lot of work as well. And frankly, I read your article about, within this context about where sort of multiculturalism or liberalism sort of fails, with the Ben Affleck, now famous Sam Harris, Ben Affleck debate on Bill Maher's, I think 2014 episode of Real Time. I mean, that was really fascinating, and I couldn't help but think of that even in this context of what we were just talking about with Will Smith, and his portrayal as arguably this, the magic black Negro, but how I think liberalism, because oftentimes when people think of Islamophobia, they see it only within the context of right-wing or conservative policies around, and being informed by Islamophobia and racializing Islam. But then on the flip side, there's the kind of the way that liberals or people on the left view Islam, and they viewed the conversations around Islamophobia being less about race, perhaps, but about these sort of values of freedom and freedom of expression and so on, the oppressed woman, the oppressed veiled woman kind of trope gets kind of played, and so I think that's a real fascinating conversation. I mean, maybe like I said, we could just sort of tease it for a future episode that I'd love to have you kind of back on to talk about.
Thank you. So yes, I have this short Bill Maher piece, and I have a longer one that will be in my book, in which I'm looking at.
Oh yeah, your forthcoming book. We definitely want to. Yeah, definitely talk about that, please.
And the larger point is, many people say Islamophobia comes out of the right, but Islamophobia is everywhere. So that article is looking at Bill Maher in particular, someone who really identifies as a liberal, and seeing how within concepts of liberalism, which most people identify, particularly Bill Maher, as advocating for free speech, LGBT rights, women's rights, these become litmus tests for Muslims to prove that they are for free speech, LGBT rights, and women's rights. So on the one hand, it becomes a litmus test. And then on the other hand, the point in that brief article is that it's actually not unusual for liberalism, which is supposed to be so inclusive, to be exclusionary. Historically, it has always been exclusionary. If we started slavery, or even if we look at excluding Catholics, it's been part of liberalism historically to purport that it is all inclusive and that these other groups don't belong because they don't pass the litmus test, when liberalism itself has never been all inclusive.
Yeah. And like I said, that's a broader conversation. And talking about the Bill Maher and Ben Affleck, appearance on that show. One of the things we've talked about on the show, and this kind of lends into something that we alluded to perhaps at the very, very beginning around studies that show this, which is, the impact that having not only positive Muslim portrayal or Arab portrayal in the media and the way that impacts policies and attitudes, but also just people who know Muslims or know and have Arab neighbors, know an Arab as a friend. And I say that in the context of Ben Affleck because, a past guest of the show, Rehan Jalali, another SoCal resident like yourself, was his personal trainer, nutritionist, kind of beefed him up for the role, of Batman. And Ben Affleck's not guilty of, because we didn't talk about Argo, but there's a whole conversation there as well. But I mean, I think the sort of vociferousness with which he defends Islam and Arabs and the kind of conversation that, or the tenor of the conversation that Bill Maher and Sam Harris were having, I think a lot, one could argue that that's informed by Ben Affleck's own sort of personal relationships with actual Muslims and Arabs, and so I don't think we can discount that, and the impact that has.
I think that's a really important point. I know the poll you're talking about that says, I don't know the statistic, but X number of Americans don't even know a Muslim. And then it correlates to a negative perception of who Muslims are.
Exactly. So, but anyway, this has been just a fascinating, far-ranging, conversation. And maybe as we kind of wrap, where can people find your work and more about you, and kind of read some of the things we've been talking about, and check out your TED Talk and so on? I know you've curated a lot of that on your website. So where can people?
I just want to say, on Twitter, anytime somebody says some vague witticism, they'll be like, "That was my TED Talk." You get to actually say, "Here's my TED Talk."
TEDx, which is different from TED, but still TEDx Talk. Yes.
Yeah.
I don't even know the distinction.
Okay, so we'll pretend there is no distinction.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
So I'm not on Facebook, I'm not on Twitter, but I have a website, and it is EvelynAlsultany.com.
Great. And then I know, of course, people can find out more about your background, your research on the USC website.
Correct.
You are at the School of. Sorry, I don't remember.
I'm in the Department of American Studies and Ethnicity.
That's right. Is Dr. Jackson like an adjunct in that department?
He is affiliated with the department, and his main appointment is in religion.
Of course, right. Okay, so certainly a past guest of the show. We joked about diffused congruence, but that's an academic term that I borrowed from Dr. Jackson back in my days at Michigan. It all comes full circle. Yeah.
Great.
But anyway, thank you so much for taking the time and having you on the show. And again, like I said, it was so easy. I reached out to you after reading your wonderful article in Newsweek about the Aladdin movie, and you were so responsive. So thank you for that. And I guess, Zaki, I'll hand it off to you. And where can people find out more about us and our show? And
you can hit like on our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/diffused congruence. If you want to send us a message, you can do that. You can also email us at diffusedcongruence@gmail.com. Sorry, I lapsed into my other thing. As for me, you can find me at my website, zakiscorner.com, Zakis Corner. That's also my Twitter. That's also my Instagram. Parvez, I know that you have a Twitter as well.
I have a Twitter, and we'll just leave it at that.
Okay.
But, yeah, you can hit me up on Facebook. I'm probably more active there. And yeah, please do reach out on the show. And again, it was a real pleasure. And we look forward to bringing you more episodes in the future. And so again, as we started, happy Eid Mubarak. And thank you for listening as always.
Mm-hmm.